There is a pill that costs $6 to manufacture. The same pill, made by the same company, using the same formula, sells for $8 in Canada, $9 in Germany, $11 in Japan, and $4.85 in the United States. And the explanation you have probably been given for why that gap exists is research and development costs, innovation incentives, and the price of progress. That explanation is not entirely wrong. It is just mostly incomplete. Because when you follow the money past the press release, past the congressional testimony, and past the pharmaceutical industry's talking points, what you find is not a system designed to fund cures. What you find is a system designed to extract the maximum possible payment from the country, least able to say no, run by a chain of middlemen most Americans have never heard of, protected by a lobbying apparatus that spends more money in Washington than the defense and aerospace industries combined. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand not just why your prescriptions cost what they cost, but who exactly is collecting the difference between what it costs to make your medicine and what you pay for it. Let's start with the number that frames everything else. Americans spend approximately $600 billion on prescription drugs every year. That is more per capita than any other developed country, by a wide margin. The United States spends roughly twice what Germany spends per person on drugs, twice what Canada spends, and nearly 3 times what the United Kingdom spends. And the standard defense of this gap is that America funds the world's pharmaceutical innovation. Drug companies need high prices in the US to recoup R&D investment, and the cheap prices everyone else pays are essentially a subsidy from American consumers. There is a grain of truth in this. American prices do subsidize global drug access to some degree. But it is a grain of truth being used to justify a mountain of extraction. Because the pharmaceutical industry's own financial disclosures tell a different story than the one they tell Congress. The top 14 largest pharmaceutical companies spent more on stock buybacks and dividends between 2016 and 2020 than they spent on research and development, more on returning cash to shareholders than on finding cures. Pfizer spent $8.9 billion on R&D in 2020. It spent $40 billion on buybacks and dividends. Johnson & Johnson spent $12 billion on R&D. It spent $29 billion on financial engineering. If the high price of drugs in America is funding the next generation of medicine, a remarkable amount of that funding is making a detour through the stock market on its way to the laboratory. But the pharmaceutical companies, as extractive as their pricing can be, are not even the most interesting part of the story. Because between the drug manufacturer and your pharmacy counter, there is a layer of the American healthcare system, so lucrative, so opaque, and so structurally protected that most people do not even know it exists. I am talking about pharmacy benefit managers. PBMs are the middlemen who manage prescription drug benefits on behalf of insurance companies and employers. The 3 largest, CVS Caremark, Express Scripts, and Optum Rx, together manage drug benefits for roughly 80% of Americans with prescription coverage. They are, for all practical purposes, a private oligopoly sitting between drug manufacturers and the 330 million people who need medication. And the way they make money is through a mechanism called rebates, which sounds innocuous and is in practice one of the most elegantly concealed wealth transfer systems in American finance. Here is how rebates work. A drug manufacturer wants its drug on the preferred formulary, the list of drugs an insurer will cover at the lowest patient cost. To get on that list, the manufacturer pays a rebate to the PBM. The rebate is a percentage of the drug's list price paid back to the middleman in exchange for favorable placement. Now here is the part that should make you pause. The higher the list price of the drug, the larger the rebate the PBM collects, which means PBMs have a direct financial incentive to prefer drugs with higher list prices, not drugs that work better, not drugs that are safer, not drugs that are cheaper, drugs whose high list price generates a larger rebate check. So the system that is supposed to negotiate drug prices down on your behalf is instead financially rewarded when drug prices go up. And the manufacturer raises list prices partly to have room to offer larger rebates, which gets them preferred formulary placement, which the PBM collects, while the patient pays a copay based on the inflated list price. Everyone in the chain profits, you pay more, and the PBM does not have to disclose to you, to your employer, or in most cases to anyone exactly how much of that rebate they are keeping, versus passing through to the insurer. It is a black box sitting in the middle of your healthcare, collecting a toll on every transaction accountable to essentially no one. Now, let's make this real with a number you may already know. Insulin, the drug that approximately 8 million Americans depend on daily to stay alive, was invented in 1921. The scientists who developed it sold the patent to the University of Toronto for $1 each, explicitly, so that insulin would remain affordable and accessible, $1. Because the people who discovered insulin understood that a life-saving medication should not become a financial instrument. For decades, insulin was cheap. In 1990, a vial of insulin cost roughly $20. By 2019, that same vial cost over $300 in the United States, a 1,400% increase over 3 decades for a drug whose underlying molecule has not changed. The 3 companies that manufacture most of the world's insulin, Eli Lilly, Sanofi, and Novo Nordisk, raised prices in near-perfect synchrony for years. When one raised prices, the others followed within months, not because costs went up, because the system allowed it, because there was no meaningful mechanism to stop it. A 2019 Senate Finance Committee investigation found that the list price increases were driven in significant part by the rebate dynamics with PBMs, with manufacturers raising list prices to maintain or improve formulary placement. The system was not broken. It was working exactly as its incentives designed it to work. And the people rationing insulin, cutting doses, going to Canadian pharmacies, or dying because they could not afford a medication that cost pennies to produce, were not collateral damage. They were the cost the system decided was acceptable. Under significant public pressure, all 3 insulin manufacturers announced price caps in 2023, limiting out-of-pocket costs for many patients. It was framed as corporate generosity. It was actually a strategic concession made when congressional scrutiny reached a level that threatened more serious intervention. The prices that were capped in 2023 were the prices those companies had spent a decade building. Now, let's talk about patents, because this is the legal architecture that makes the whole system possible, and that is being systematically gamed in ways most people do not realize. In the United States, a new drug gets a period of patent protection, typically 20 years from the date of filing, during which no competitor can make a generic version. The logic is sound. You need exclusivity to recoup R&D investment and incentivize innovation. But what actually happens is something called evergreening. Evergreening is the practice of filing new patents on minor modifications to existing drugs to extend the effective exclusivity period far beyond the original intent. A slightly different coating, a different dosage form, a new delivery mechanism. Each variation generates a new patent, potentially adding years to exclusivity, during which the original brand name drug faces no generic competition. A 2018 study in JAMA Internal Medicine found that of 100 best-selling drugs analyzed, the average market exclusivity period was 38 years, almost double the 20-year statutory patent term, because of the average 3.5 new patents filed per drug after the original approval. And the FDA's Orange Book, the official list of drug patents, has been described by legal scholars as a mechanism that incumbent manufacturers use to create patent thickets, dense enough to keep generics out indefinitely, while the drug's manufacturer collects monopoly pricing year after year. AbbVie's Humira, the world's best-selling drug for years, had over 130 patents filed around it, creating a wall of intellectual property that kept biosimilar competitors out of the US market for years after they were available, and far cheaper in Europe. The drug cost roughly $40,000 per Pascal Tient per year in the United States. In Germany, the same drug cost roughly $7,000. The difference was not innovation, it was intellectual property strategy. And now let's connect it all back to Washington, because none of this persists without political protection. The pharmaceutical and health products industry spent over $5.7 billion on federal lobbying between 1998 and 2022, more than any other industry. In 2022 alone, the sector spent $375 million on lobbying, employing roughly 1,500 lobbyists in Washington. That is nearly 3 lobbyists for every single member of Congress. And the result of that investment is visible in the law. Until the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, Medicare, the government program covering over 60 million Americans, was legally prohibited from negotiating drug prices directly. Prohibited by law. The largest purchaser of prescription drugs in the United States was barred from using its purchasing power to negotiate lower prices, while every other developed country's government negotiated aggressively. That prohibition was not an accident. It was inserted into the 2003 law that created Medicare Part D through a process that investigators later found involved significant pharmaceutical lobbying. The non-interference clause, as it was called, cost American patients and taxpayers an estimated $50 billion a year in higher drug costs for nearly 2 decades. It was partially addressed in 2022. The industry is already working on limiting the scope of that reform. So what does this mean for you practically right now? First, if you are prescribed a brand-name drug, always ask your doctor whether a generic or therapeutic equivalent exists. Generics are required to have the same active ingredient at the same dosage, and are typically 80 to 85% cheaper. Doctors do not always prescribe them automatically because they are sometimes not up to date on what generics are available. Ask the question. It costs nothing. Second, if you are paying out of pocket, use GoodRx or a similar comparison tool before filling any prescription. Cash prices at different pharmacies vary enormously and are sometimes lower than insurance copays, especially for generics. This should not be necessary. The system should be transparent. It is not. Work with what exists. Third, for expensive brand-name drugs. Most manufacturers have patient assistance programs that provide the drug free or at reduced cost for people below certain income thresholds. These programs exist partly for genuine compassion and partly as a public relations strategy. Either way, the programs are real. If you cannot afford a medication, check the manufacturer's website before going without. Fourth, understand that the PBM layer, the rebate system, and the patent evergreening are all policy choices, not laws of nature. They exist because the people who benefit from them have spent billions ensuring that the people who could change them do not. That dynamic only changes when the political cost of leaving it unchanged exceeds the financial benefit of protecting it, which historically requires a very large number of people being very clearly aware of exactly how the system works. So I want to hear where you land. Do you think American drug pricing is a painful but necessary feature of the system that funds innovation the rest of the world benefits from? B, a structurally corrupt extraction machine that requires fundamental regulatory overhaul? Or C, somewhere in the middle, where the innovation argument has merit, but the PBM layer and patent gaming have gone so far beyond reasonable that reform is overdue regardless of where you land on pharmaceutical profits? Drop your take in the comments, and the next time someone tells you drug prices are high because of research and development, ask them to explain the rebate system. Ask them to explain 130 patents on a single drug. Ask them to explain why the same pill costs $8 in Germany and $400 3 hours north of the border. The answer is not science. It is not innovation. It is not the cost of discovery. It is a system that was designed, lobbied for, legally protected, and financially optimized to produce exactly the prices you are paying. And the distance between what your medicine costs to make and what you pay at the pharmacy counter is not the price of progress. It is the price of access to the United States Congress.